Hi everyone, thanks for joining Adam and I today as we talk a little bit more about uniform guidance. Today we wanted to talk about some common findings and issues that we find as we audit a nonprofit organization that has federal and or state dollars that are subject to a uniform guidance audit.
And it's really important to be mindful of findings and other issues that prop up within a uniform guidance audit because unlike your regular financial statement audit, in the UG or uniform guidance audit, these findings get reported right in the financial statements. So any reader can see any findings, any deficiencies in controls. So you really want to make sure that your audits are going smoothly.
Absolutely. So one of the requirements for a uniform guidance audit is that you're in compliance with allowable costs and allowable services. So when we are testing those areas, some of the most common mistakes or issues that we find is a lack of documentation. A lot of times grants are cost reimbursement, so we are looking at payroll and non-payroll expenses to make sure that they are allowable and you have all of the proper supporting documentation. Sometimes we find that invoices can't be found, and so there is a lack of documentation there with regard to our testing. So what happens is those amounts then become questionable because we don't know if they were actually legitimate, if there's no backup and no third-party support, so they can rise to the level of being a finding within the financials.
And another area in that area, so allowable costs and activities, is that there are certain cost rules for uniform guidance. So we have seen plenty of times in the past that a cost that's considered disallowed is being reported under the grant contract as allowable. That by itself, as it falls outside the cost rules, it's a finding. So it's just really important to understand what those cost rules are and making sure that you have a team in place that can comply with those.
Mm-hmm. One compliance requirement too is period of performance. So if your allowable costs, it kind of ties into the cost piece, if those costs are incurred during your fiscal year, but the period of performance is that grant period, you can't necessarily put in a cost from a year ago or something that you're going to incur in the future. So that's where those costs and that period that you're posting them to becomes really important because it could become an issue.
And then, just constantly hitting on allowable costs, because this is a big area where we see a lot of issues, is that besides having proper documentation, meaning the invoice of the cost, it's making sure you have proper policies in place for allocating those costs as well. A lot of times you may have a general cost that's being allocated amongst different programs and grants, and you want to make sure that those costs are being properly allocated accordingly to your policies. So it's really important to have that in place, and then those policies are being followed as well.
Mm-hmm. And the proper reviews and controls to make sure that invoices are properly authorized for payment, that salaries are appropriate, someone's reviewing your journal entries to make sure that those allocations are being posted properly. Internal controls is really an important area here because an organization is responsible for designing those controls to make sure that you are in compliance with all of these requirements.
Yeah. So where should we go next?
So I would
You're
say
driving the car, so where are we going?
Cash management. So cash management is a compliance requirement, and the rules say that one, it has to be a written policy that your organization has as to whether you draw down in advance of incurring the expenses or whether you draw down after you incur the expenses. If you draw down on government funds prior to incurring the expenses, you need to minimize the time in which it's spent. So you're not able to draw down on those funds and then hold it for 30 days, 60 days before you pay out expenses. There has to be a minimization there as to when you spend it out. And then the funds also have to be in an interest-bearing account. Most organizations will just go the reimbursement method because it's easier. So they'll incur the costs, go in and draw down every 2 weeks, every month, and then that makes it a little bit easier. But it is a policy that you have to have documented.
Yeah, it's definitely the safest path to just treat it as a cost reimbursement instead of advancing yourself the funds. Just because you come into that issue where you're drawing down the funds, but spend it in a timely manner, and then you're running into compliance issues with your grants. One quick story on cash management, because I have one here, is I had once the organization received a large grant. It was about $5-6 million. They had the ability to draw down on the funds, and day one of the award, they drew down all the money. That's a big no-no.
The whole $5 million.
The whole $5 million on day one. So that's what you want to avoid. That's kind of the stuff that you do not want to do, because you don't want to run afoul of uniform guidance, of your granting agency. They were fine in the end, but it just, you want to avoid those conversations.
So another key compliance area is procurement. So the whole title was procurement, suspension, and debarment. And what that means is you need to have some competitive bids for your vendors and who you're going to use. So you want to make sure that your vendor is allowable, that they're not suspended or debarred, and you go through a bidding process. But the key here with procurement is that it needs to be a written policy. So a lot of times it's verbal within the organization. You do have a bidding process, but it is something that needs to be a written policy. Otherwise, it could be a finding.
And with procurement as well, there's different thresholds regarding the policy. So based on the size of the purchase that you're looking to make, there's different rules from your guidance where based on that size, there's different options for you. So in a higher purchase, you might need like a blind bid, competitive bids, versus a much smaller purchase where maybe you just need to just casually check a couple prices online and then go with the lowest bid, whatever that is. And that all needs to be documented within your procurement policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So not always a full bidding process for smaller purchases. They call them micro purchases.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You want to take the next one?
All right, I'll take the next one. All right, so we're going to move over now to subrecipient monitoring. So this is an area where you receive a grant and you're passing those funds down to other grantees, potentially. Because this is a complicated area because sometimes they can be considered a subrecipient and sometimes they can be considered a subcontractor. And it's really important to make that distinction because a contractor is just simply a vendor for the services being performed. Whereas a sub-grantee, there's certain rules that you, as the original grantor or the original one receiving the grant, has to follow to make sure that those grantees are also following the grant requirements. So part of that is telling them that they need to follow the grant requirements. That's one that's commonly missed. But then there's also others where you have to make sure that they're following through the requirements, you're doing your due process, you're doing site visits if needed, checking and reporting. You're basically acting as if you're the granting agency for that grantee.
Yeah. So that subrecipient monitoring is also really an important area. All right.
So one last area that's kind of outside the realm of compliance requirements is, and what we find some common issues with, is the CIFA. So the CIFA is kind of the start of the whole audit. That's ultimately what we're auditing. And a lot of times there could be incorrect items on there, not all the grants are on there, or organization just doesn't know how to prep it, right?
Absolutely. So preparing that schedule of expenditures is the responsibility of an organization. So it's not the auditor responsibility. As an auditor, our responsibility is to audit it and audit the completeness and to make sure it's accurate, but it's really not our responsibility to be preparing it. So that falls within the organization. And the CIFA has to have certain required elements and certain required columns based on the guidance. So you want to make sure that when you are prepping the CIFA, you have all of those required columns, all of the required elements, and you have the proper reporting and general ledger set up to be able to facilitate that reporting and be able to identify all the grants that should be on there each year.
Yeah. So that's kind of a quick snapshot of the very common findings and mistakes that we find on uniform guidance audits. And hopefully this is helpful. So for your next uniform guidance audit, you are compliance finding free and you have no issues at all.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.